As we ended last week's lesson, we were talking briefly about the number and nature of ethical norms. We listed various approaches there and briefly spoke of them. We talked about antinomianism, generalism, utilitarianism, absolutism, and hierarchicalism. We briefly touched on those last week, and this week we're going to go a little bit more in depth in this discussion of the number and nature of ethical norms. What we mean when we discuss the nature of ethical norms is the study and discussion of whether there are absolutes that transcend our experiences, or if our ethical norms are not absolute and relative to our culture and our experiences. In other words, the two approaches to the nature of ethical norms is absolutism and relativism. Absolutism says there are ethical norms that are universal and transcend our experience and our culture. In other words, what was moral 2,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago would be moral today and has not changed as our cultures have changed or is not relative to our culture or our experiences. On the other hand, relativism says that ethical norms are relative to our experiences. So whatever is good for us now in our experiences, or whatever is pragmatic now, is good, and so our experiences and our needs make ethical norms either good or bad. When we're discussing the number of ethical norms, the discussion revolves around, is there one or is there many ethical norms? Is there just one ethical norm, or are there many? So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the number and nature of ethical norms. In discussing the various approaches to the number and nature of ethical norms, there are various approaches, and one approach is called antinomianism. Antinomianism says there is no ethical norms. Anti means against, and nomos means law, so antinomianism etymologically says it's against the law. There are no ethical norms. Well, the problem with antinomianism is it's just simply not practical. As we saw in Romans 1, 2, and 3, God says, the Bible says, the law is written in our hearts. So the bottom line is humans will not live without ethical norms. In other words, humans will not live, lost or saved, will not live in an anarchist society where there's no ethical norms. Again, Romans 1 and 2 teaches us that the law is written in our hearts. It doesn't make us righteous. It shows we're sinners. Now, if you reject the Bible, then you believe the law is written in our hearts, and us living the law makes us righteous. But either way, man will not live in an antinomian society. But there are societies that are anarchy, and there are groups called anarchy groups, and those groups, by and large, are based on a philosophy called progressivism. In other words, if you throw God out, then you believe society is progressing through struggle, so therefore the struggle against evil or the struggle against bad, it produces good. That's yin-yang and those philosophies. Marxism is based on an anarchy philosophy where you create revolutions to bring down the system in order to replace it with a better system. So in that system of progressivism, anarchy produces good. So in other words, you have to have an anarchy society or a revolution to produce good. So therefore, the good is relative to the struggle between good and evil. So in an anarchist society, you have groups that are anarchies or terrorism, because terrorism produces anarchy, and therefore the anarchy brings down the system to where you replace it with a better system. That's where relativism comes in antinomianism. Another approach to the number and nature of ethical norms is generalism. Generalism says there are no specific norms, only general norms. Again, that's not practical because, by and large, our Supreme Court and our state Supreme Courts and our local judges and our federal judges and our state judges are there because we have to deal with specifics. So generalism would tell us that there are general ethical norms and that those are just general and there are no specifics. But again, by and large, that's just not practical. Another approach to the number and nature of ethical norms is called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism teaches that there is one ethical norm, and that's called the ethic of love, according to Joseph Fletcher. In other words, Joseph Fletcher would say there is one ethical norm, and that's to do the greatest good for the greatest number, or do the loving thing that produces the greatest good for the greatest number. Joseph Fletcher would have said the loving thing is to do the greatest good for the greatest number. Other proponents of utilitarianism would be John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. The problem with utilitarianism is you have to choose what's good for the greatest number, and if something impedes the good for the greatest number, then the people who are not in that greater number is the ones who are liquidators or suffer. Give an example. If there is one life raft and it has a capacity for 10 people, and if something happens to that life raft and only 5 people can live in that life raft or it'll sink, then you have to decide who stays in. In other words, if you have a life raft who has a capacity for 5 people, or a life raft that has a capacity for 10 people, and you've got 15 people to go on the raft that has only the capacity for 10, then you're going to have to decide who stays on the raft and who goes off the raft. So if you've got 10 people, well, you've got 15 people and the raft will only hold 10, then what's the greatest good for the greatest number? Well, if only 10 can go on, then who do you decide stays on the raft? And that decision is going to be based on what can produce the greatest good for the greatest number. Well, if the raft can only hold 10 people, that's the greatest number. Then you have to liquidate 5 people based on some criteria. And if you have 5 engineers and 5 doctors, and then the other 5 people out of the 15 there, the other 5 people are not, maybe their IQ is average or below average, then the greatest good for the greatest number would be able to save all the doctors and all of the engineers, because they can probably save the raft and fix the raft if it tears up, and they'll be able to, the doctors will be able to treat the people who get sick on the raft. So the greatest good for the greatest number would probably you would probably need to save the doctors and the engineers and liquidate those that are IQ is around 70. So that's utilitarianism, do the greatest good for the greatest number. But again, you see how that ethic is relative to whatever people decide are the greatest good for the greatest number. Another approach to the number and nature of ethical norms is absolutism. Absolutism tells us that there are universal ethical norms and they are absolute, they're not relative. There are 2 types of absolutism. Ideal absolutism teaches that there are absolutes and they don't conflict. On the other hand, conflicting absolutism says there are absolutes and they will conflict. The issue of absolutes conflicting comes up. Let me give you an example of how absolutes may conflict. Most often, the issue of Corrie ten Boom and hiding the Jews during the time of Hitler. Corrie ten Boom hid Jews in her basement, and in her basement, when the Gestapo came, they asked her the question, "Are you hiding Jews in your basement?" Now, Corrie ten Boom told them no. Now, an ideal absolutist would say that those absolutes there, the issue of lying or not to lie, is not a conflict. words, an ideal absolutist would say that the biblical law of bearing false witness does not apply here. Corrie ten Boom's not really bearing false witness against the Gestapo or against the Jewish in her basement. She's just trying to save the Jews from getting killed by the Gestapo. So the ideal absolutist would say that in that case, they're not conflicting. So the ideal absolutism would try to explain away the conflicts. On the other hand, a conflicting absolutist would say that yes, those absolutes are conflicting. In other words, she is facing the Gestapo there, or the German soldiers, and it would really be a lie to tell them that the Jews are in her basement. So there is a conflict there, but a conflicting absolutist would say, go ahead and lie and ask forgiveness later. So that's the difference between ideal absolutism and conflicting absolutism. Another approach to the number and nature of ethical norms is called hierarchicalism. This approach says that there are absolutes, but when they conflict, we must choose the act that is the highest good. So in the case of Corrie ten Boom, the way we decide on how to act in that situation is there is a conflict there, but saving the Jews in her basement will be the highest good, so therefore she should choose the absolute of actually hiding the Jews in her basement there, of saving lives.